Good afternoon and welcome. This is the first in a series of virtual events that we, the APM Governance SIG, is hosting on the role of sponsor and sponsorship. So let's begin. You're talking or you're listening to Martin Samphire at the moment. I'm the chair of the APM Governance SIG, and I'm also owner and director of 3PMXL, which is a consultancy helping organisations to vision and implement business transformation and improve their change and P3M processes. Now, I'm joined by two of my colleagues today, Katherine Williams and Richard Zavitz, who will quickly introduce themselves.
Thank you, Martin. Hi everyone, my name is Katherine Williams. I'm a management consultant at RSM UK. I work with organisations across multiple sectors, supporting them in their development of project and programme management capability. In particular, I work with large-scale co-owned programmes and support sponsors and their delivery teams through the change journey.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Katherine. Happy to be here today, and thank you for everyone who's joining us today. My name is Richard Zavitz. I'm Principal Sponsor at Transport for London, currently working in the joint sponsorship team for the Crossrail project. I've been in sponsorship for about 6 years now, after starting my career in engineering of major infrastructure projects.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, so this is the first event of the series, as I say, where we're looking to share the results of a sponsor survey we've recently carried out. So the GovSIG's or Governance SIG's mission is to be the focus and reference point for those interested in the governance of change, to advance the understanding amongst both members of the APM and others, contribute towards the development of good practice, and influence in particular those accountable for the governance of change and improve their practices. So this is really about that latter bit, about helping to make people understand what's going on and to improve good practice in governance. So our contribution to good governance is manifold. Some of you may be aware of a guide called Directing Change and also another one called Sponsoring Change. We're going to refer to both of those today. So I think everyone now understands and recognises that enhanced governance leads to greater success at project, programme and portfolio level, both in terms of individual governance on individual programme, but also in terms of enterprise-wide governance. The individual governance responsibility very much of the sponsor, whereas the enterprise-wide governance very much the responsibility of the board. On your screen now, you can see two definitions of the role of sponsor, one from the APM Body of Knowledge 7th edition, the other one from Sponsoring Change. The key about this is that the sponsor role is very much focused on outcomes. It's all about making sure that the project is a success, and the ultimate success measure of a project or programme is the outcome. So the sponsor has an interesting role, difficult some would say, because they are very much looking for the best path through what's often an ambiguous and uncertain time to come up with the most beneficial outcome or benefits, and those have to stay in front of mind. The sponsor is a pivotal link between the business on the one hand, which is very much about the permanent business as usual organisation, and the project or programme on the other hand, which is by definition temporary. The sponsor has to straddle both, has a pivotal role, and provides that leadership through dynamic and ambiguous times like we have at the moment. The next two slides I'm showing, this is an extract from Sponsoring Change, our guide, I mentioned it before, which talks about the core functions that the sponsor is responsible for to the business, as accountable to the board of the organisation. And also the second one is what the sponsor does for the project manager. Again, if you're not familiar with Sponsoring Change and Directing Change, I recommend that you do. And you're soon going to get a poll question regarding your awareness of the guide Sponsoring Change. So let's move on to the survey. A bit of background. The Sponsoring Change, the guide, was first published in 2019. In 2013, we did a benchmarking study where one of the things we found was a lack of consistency in adopting sponsorship and developing sponsors. 2015, the APM did a study on conditions for project success, and 3 of the 12 factors that they identified were effective governance, capable sponsors, and a supportive organisation. Absolutely crucial. So sponsoring change was then updated in 2018 at edition 2, which incorporated a number of the findings from those various studies. And then we launched the sponsor survey at the back end of 2019, and the results have been analysed this year with more than over 50 respondents representing over 100 results. So we're now going to move on to look at the approach and the results. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Katherine, and Katherine's going to take you through some of the core findings from the survey results. Katherine.
So as Martin indicated, I'm just going to speak a little bit about the analysis that we did of the survey results. So in terms of the approach that we used, so we used SurveyMonkey to collect the views of a range of individuals in the project profession. So this ranged from board directors, senior executives in sponsor roles and delivery professionals. The list that you can see on your screen at the moment summarises the areas of the survey that we focused on. And so the 2 key elements that we were looking to really gain insight on are on this list here. That's how the governance of change contributes to successful project outcomes, and also how the board holds sponsors to account for successful outcomes of change. As part of the analysis, we compared how different levels and remits of roles reflected on these areas, in particular looking at accountability and whether there was any impact on how positively accountable and non-accountable individuals responded across these areas. So on your screen now you should see a breakdown of the roles that we had responses from. So as you can see, there were 56 surveys completed, but interestingly within these there were individuals who identified that they held multiple sponsor related or board delivery roles. A key statistic actually is that 70% of board directors and sponsors reported also holding a delivery role. As you can see by the chart, 50% of the population carry out a sponsor role. So these are highlighted in shades of blue, and we've categorised here as head of sponsorship, executive sponsor and delegated sponsor. So the sponsor roles, so the blue categories here, form the main focus point for the analysis, and then the input from the board and the delivery roles, so the orange and the green here, have provided us with really valuable comparators. So the survey that we designed allowed individuals to input their roles as free text responses. The reason we did this was we wanted to ensure that all role titles and variances in role remits were captured. This resulted in a high volume of different job titles, as you can see on the screen. So we carried out a mapping exercise of the roles in these free text responses and categorised them. As you can see in the graphic, the 4 core role categories are identified in the centre of the grid. The head of sponsorship category in this case reflects what we would describe as a profession lead, but may also be interpreted as a delegated sponsor role. So moving into the analysis, this is one of the key areas I identified up front. So looking at governance of change leading to success. The question we actually posed here was, how well does your governance of change, so authorities, processes, behaviours, roles, contribute to successful project outcomes, whether that's business benefits, enhanced business performance for the organisation that you work within. So in this case, the darker colours in this chart reflect a positive response, and the lighter reflect a negative response, i.e. extremely well through to poorly. The variance in view between the board directors and executive sponsors in particular is quite clear here. The positivity of board directors in the darker blue colours versus the paler colours in the exec sponsor response is quite stark. Similarly, delegated sponsor and non-sponsor delivery roles also reflect a more negative view in this case. Based on the responses that we got, we did some further analysis, and overall we found that board directors are 1.7 times more positive overall than sponsors in this case. The other key area I flagged up front was in terms of holding sponsors to account. So again, the question posed here was, how well does the board hold sponsors to account for successful outcomes of change? Again, in a similar outcome to the previous question, the positivity of the board in relation to their ability to hold sponsors to account is quite notable. This time, the board were actually 3.7 times more positive overall than the executive sponsor roles, who showed the least positive view, with the majority of the paler coloured responses, as you can see here. A slightly more specific question that we posed was whether performance criteria exists for changes that are being sponsored. The answer here was actually relatively clear-cut across the range of role categories. So the numbers that you see on the screen here are averages of all of the respondents in all job roles. So as you can see, only 9% stated that criteria were non-existent in their organisations. So that was a positive finding. However, in direct comparison to that, what we also asked was whether or not the criteria for success are captured in personal objectives, or whether they're actually reviewed. And across the board, the results were consistent in all roles, identifying that it's very rarely that these criteria are incorporated into objectives. So quite a contrast in terms of existence, but unfortunately not captured or reviewed. So the next section of the survey focused on sponsor competencies, which you can see listed on the slide here. Just for anyone who's interested in the background reading for this, the reference point for selecting these competencies was the APM Body of Knowledge 7th edition, just in conjunction with the descriptions of roles that we received through the survey. And what we asked was if respondents could identify against each of these competencies whether they class themselves as being an expert, a practitioner, or a learner. We also then sort of took that one level further and said against each of those would individuals identify themselves as being trained or untrained. So just reflecting on these competencies, we would just like to know your opinion. We're going to take the 5, what we reflect as being the 5 core of these competencies, and ask you what you think is the most important competency for an effective sponsor. So that poll should now be showing on your screen. So what we've done here is focus on a few key areas. We received a significant amount of data on the competency questions, but we found a few really interesting cuts of the results that we thought would be worthwhile sharing with you. So firstly, here we're looking at senior roles. So what we're classing as senior roles here are board directors, heads of profession, and executive sponsors. So interestingly, more than 70% of senior roles identified themselves as being experts or practitioners in all of the competencies. So this is the orange and the blue responses you can see here in the graphic. The experts were identified in sort of the central competencies that you can see here: securing funding, developing and communicating the project vision, and stakeholder engagement in particular, in the blue here, just some to draw out. Of the orange band, which is the practitioner band, most reported being trained rather than untrained practitioners. However, In the green, which is the sort of the learner category in each of these competencies, interestingly, more than 20% reported being untrained rather than trained, which was an interesting comparison between practitioner and learner. So that's the senior level roles. And then we did a similar exercise for delegated sponsors, just to draw some comparisons with the senior level roles. So in this case, more than 90% of delegated sponsors reported being experts or practitioners. And this is demonstrated in the orange and the blue here. This compares to 70% with the senior roles, so a much higher level of practitioner and expert across all of the competencies. Just to draw on some variances between trained and untrained, which is not visible in this chart here, but we thought was worth sharing, was that more than 50% of the respondents that are captured in this graph reported being experts, so that's the blue, or trained practitioners, so that's the orange, across all of the competencies. Up to 40%, however, of delegated sponsors reported being untrained practitioners, which only leaves, so the 10%, the green here, as learners, identified themselves as being untrained learners. So again, this just reflects overall, in comparison to the senior roles, that there's a broader coverage of competencies at both the expert and practitioner levels, and a much higher level of trained individuals in the delegated sponsor category, a much lower level of untrained at all of the expert, practitioner and learner categories. So those are just a few insights from the competency assessment that we just wanted to share with you. One of the other sort of key questions we included in the survey was around interest in sponsor training. So as you can see here on the screen, the overall level of interest in training was actually very low, represented by the sort of the darker shades of blue at the not at all interested end of the spectrum. Just reflecting on that, with sort of the relatively low percentages of both the senior and delegated sponsor roles identifying themselves as being untrained, it may be the case that training is felt to be not needed, hence the sort of the response levels here. Interestingly, the highest levels of interest were identified in the non-sponsor delivery roles, which you can see at the bottom of the graph there. Just to sort of add a little bit to this, we looked at availability of sponsor training within respondents' organisations. So as you can see on the screen here, an average of 55% of the respondents indicated that sponsor training was available in their organisations. So this could again be another reason that the interest in training was lower, because the sort of the organisations these individuals were coming from had perhaps already had that content available for them. The table at the bottom of the slide here just shows the areas that were identified by the survey respondents as being sort of the most and the least needed in terms of improving overall competencies. There is correlation between these and the competency levels. So in particular, with business case development, which is number one on the most list, there were actually very few senior or delegated sponsors who stated they were experts in this area. So it was unsurprising for us to see this at the top of the most list. And just one final reflection on the survey in terms of the benefits of training. So we compared the views of sort of the expert and the trained categories, and then the untrained on the two key themes that I highlighted up front. So this is the governance of change and holding sponsors to account. Just summarised on the screen here that actually training correlates to a more positive view on the sort of the governance of change theme, and in particular we've just pulled out two of the competencies there where the sort of trained areas reflected that positive view, so business case development and realising benefits. And then on the sort of holding sponsors to account for successful outcomes of change, this actually was the other way. So the trained population held a more negative view on how well sponsors were being held to account, and in particular this was highlighted in the areas of securing funds and business case development. So that's a summary of the work we did on the survey. I'd just now like to hand over to Richard, who's going to talk a bit about taking those outcomes forward and the work that's going to be done on the sort of the forward set of these webinars over the next few months.
Great, thank you, Katherine. So I'll be looking at the recommendations that are really being drawn from the results of the sponsor survey. But I just wanted to note that these are really works in progress. And as Martin said, we have upcoming webinars on the 23rd of July and the 30th of July to really get into the detail with people who are actually in the field working as sponsors. So the first one is about speaking with the senior leaders and then the practitioners. And we really want to develop these further. So again, really looking to get your feedback and input. So onto the recommendations. So as part of the survey, we noticed that we can really group the roles that we've identified by the level of authority. And we have a business owner, the executive sponsor that we're really describing as the accountable party, and then a delegated sponsor where we view that as more as the responsible role, who's appointed by the executive sponsor to carry out specific skills on their behalf, or specific tasks on their behalf. So to help distinguish the roles within the profession, we're really making the recommendation to use prefixes to distinguish between the authority levels of sponsorship. And we've made this suggestion of executive sponsor and delegated sponsor. We see this to help clarify the roles, both within the project, but also in regards to the business. So as Martin mentioned, the sponsor is really that liaison between the two. But further, it will help with recruitment to get the right people for the right roles, but then also help define performance development for people within these roles so that specific programs can be catered to the different levels. So what do we mean by kind of the role of the executive sponsor and the delegated sponsor? So we see the executive sponsor is really that senior leader who's accountable for the benefits of the investment, and they would report to the board. So very much an upward facing role, first point of contact, and they would agree and work with the delegated sponsors to agree the delegation for one, but then also the actions that the delegated sponsor would carry out on their behalf. Chair steering groups and really be that kind of voice and advocate for the project with the senior team within the organization. We might not see necessarily that the executive sponsor is the role title, but as we noticed within the number of roles identified, that quite a few roles can be mapped on to this type of role. And they'll have lots of common features. So if we go to the next slide, we're then looking at, well, what are some of the tasks of the delegated sponsor? And we see them as more of the day-to-day interactions with the project, very much the responsible party. Again, still having responsibility for the benefits and representing the investment as an advocate, but would report up and be accountable to the executive sponsor, not necessarily directly to the organization like the executive sponsor would be. In some of our discussions too, we've noticed that it could be a team of delegated sponsors, and some may actually have subject matter expertise within the sponsorship team. But again, they would accept actions, review, run impacts of the benefits and the business case when changes are proposed from the project or when things go not necessarily to plan. And they would just support the change throughout the governance process. So that's kind of what we mean by the distinction. Again, it's probably unlikely that someone will be called a delegated sponsor in their role title, but it's kind of a collective, and we see the distinction as being quite important, I think, to move the discussion of sponsorship forward within the project profession. So looking at our second recommendation, this one's really linked to the results we received on the governance of change. As Katherine mentioned, there was really an overall impression that the governance of change contributes to successful project outcomes. But we noticed that board directors were much more positive than sponsors. So we kind of asked the question as to why. So we see the senior leaders, so we're suggesting, I think, that the senior leaders who oversee and spend the money will see the wider picture. So you would expect them to be positive about the investments that effectively they've sanctioned, they've agreed to go forward with these. So they're going to see, so we suggest that they're going to see more positivity, I think, in regards to how their current processes are working to make sure that that investment goes as planned. And then maybe the ones who are involved in more of the day-to-day process, so even the executive sponsor, but more so maybe the delegated sponsor, maybe feel that they can see better ways of doing things. So our recommendation is really that the board should engage with sponsors for feedback on the governance processes and identify and implement improvements. But then also we see that there's opportunities for the organization to really support sponsorship, to make sure that they're valued, that the roles and accountabilities are acknowledged, valued, supported across the organization, so that it's just sponsors don't feel like they're in the middle, that they're actually supported both from the top and respected within the project teams. So those are some recommendations on how maybe we can start to fill some of those gaps to make sure board directors have a realistic view, I think, of how the governance of change processes are working. So the next recommendation is really about the results linked to holding sponsors to account. And again, here we saw board directors, we said 3.7 times more positive of their ability to hold sponsors, hold executive sponsors to account. But we're not quite sure why there's such a gap in the views. And we're really going to be taking this question in particular away to talk with the executive sponsors at our session on the 23rd of July. To really see what, from the executive sponsors' view, how they're held to account, and maybe some suggestions from the board on what the board can do. But initially, for now, we have some. We've presented previously recommendations within our publication, Directing Change, which outlines principles of effective governance, both for boards and sponsors, and it's a good resource that includes role-based checklists, but it's a good resource just to see some best practices and establishes some tools to help establish expectations and that can be used to monitor the implementation of governance of change. So really the recommendation here is about agreeing with sponsors, so boards and sponsors really working together to agree expectations for both performance that is linked to project outcomes and competencies, and then also how it's implemented, so in a clear and consistent way with regular opportunities for feedback. So it's really about providing that support to the sponsor, executive sponsor, but also the sponsor team to make sure that the business supports the decisions that they're making and the position that they're in, and overall provides that accountability to the sponsors to develop those and deliver those benefits. So the next recommendation is really looking at the differences between the roles, the senior roles being identified, having that higher ability, but in a smaller number of competencies. So kind of off the cuff, we can say they have a deep knowledge. Delegated sponsors maybe having that broader knowledge, competencies, maybe to a lesser degree, but across all of those areas that we identified in the survey. But I think ultimately there is a difference between the two, and that's what really we're trying to capture. But currently there doesn't exist a competency model for sponsorship, nor not just what competencies would be included, but also the level of competence expected for each role, or in each level within that role. So without a model, there's really no objective way to assess what sponsors need to know or what is required to sponsor a project of a certain complexity and risk. So we see that a fairly big gap within the project profession at the moment. So one of our main recommendations really is to develop a competency model. Now we know some organizations have already developed competency models, and again that's part of our webinar series, is to discuss with a range of organizations what they have come up with, what support they need, and really how they apply that and the benefits that they get from it. And potentially that's a role for the APM to play going forward in complement to their current competency model on project project management and the project profession. But again, this webinar, we'll touch on that within the 2 webinars coming up in July, but primarily will be a discussion for the autumn when we move forward with some of our recommendations that come out of this engagement process. And again, we're really looking for your feedback. So either put some questions in and we can kind of explore those as part of this webinar, or feel free to get in touch on the back of the blogs that we released this week and through the APM, either the hub if you're a member or through the website. So the next recommendations really focus on the training aspects. So just to start out on maybe what a training program should focus on. So it's not just about identifying the competencies, but also how we develop within them. So the survey showed that, as Katherine said, training correlated to holding a more positive view on the governance of change. So there's really definitely benefit for the individual to develop expertise within the sponsorship realm to understand, I think, what their role would be, but then also how that links into the overall objective of realizing benefits. So I think from what we saw in the survey is that the highest gap was really within business case development and realizing actual benefits, which, even going back to the body of knowledge, really are clear areas of responsibility for sponsors. So that makes sense. Really developing that type of expertise in those areas would really kind of improve your views on how we're contributing to the success of the investment. Now, not just in terms of personal training, but organizational competencies were also explored. And I think it's that question about how organizations kind of collectively, I think, create that culture to hold teams to account, so holding the delivery teams to account, but then also engaging with stakeholders. So those are some of the areas that really shone through from that organizational competence that really cuts across individuals and really goes down to maybe bigger processes that are involved in these things. So I think it's not just, it's hard to just say that if you kind of set up a training program in these areas, you're going to receive success. But I think that's kind of what we're starting the conversation with, and we really want to see how that develops through our discussions to then come up with the idea of, I think, putting a comprehensive training program together. So the next recommendation is not just looking at sponsors, because we do have to recognize that the board has responsibilities here as well. So about their role in holding sponsors to account, and actually how they go about doing that, and is there training available for them in that area. And I think because training correlated to holding a more negative view on how well the board holds sponsors to account, the suggestion really is actually, as sponsors increase their training, they maybe expect more from their boards, and actually boards should also do their job of understanding how they need to hold sponsors to account, how they provide support to sponsors, and training can be focused in that area as well. And our final recommendation was really picking up on the idea that how training is provided should be varied, because we noticed that as people were trained, they had a bigger interest in training. So a one-off training program won't be sufficient for very many people. And also, given the range of competencies within the area of sponsorship, I think the idea of having a varied training program is really encouraged to cover the identified sponsor competencies rather than a one-off course. So again, part of your training hopefully is attending these webinars, so we appreciate that. But also just looking at some of the poll results, we did notice some correlations to some of the results that we saw. So, I mean, the majority of participants today are non-sponsor delivery roles, and clearly there's an interest there in learning more about sponsorship. So that really kind of links to one of the observations we saw in the survey, which is great. But then also too, the main result for communicating vision was really viewed as kind of the top competency. But we noticed in our survey results that was actually competencies that had the least training available. So again, there's a gap there that clearly needs to be filled. So I think just wanted to recap quickly on our recommendations. So number one is really about using that prefix, but just kind of distinguishing primarily between executive and delegated sponsor, or the counterparty, the responsible party. Really looking at opportunities for improvement in the process, so how boards engage and get support in the processes. Really looking at supporting and rewarding people within the sponsor roles, making sure that the organization is supporting them. The next one on competency development is really about potentially professionalizing that role, how we can retain and attract the best people, but also giving that opportunity to people to focus their development within the sponsor area, so how they can develop their career. Really looking at the need to train and develop, but not limited to sponsors, but also the board. And looking at how we can provide a comprehensive and varied program. So again, we mentioned how potentially the APM can get involved in that, provide more specific resources for sponsors, and the governance SIG has really been leading on that up to now. But also how potentially we can come together as a community of practice and really kind of help each other across industries. And again, through our webinars coming up, we're really hoping to focus in on that. So I think we'll just have a quick poll and then open up to questions. And I'll hand over to Martin, who will get us going with some questions.
Thanks, Richard and Katherine. Thank you both very much for a very insightful presentation. And I know how difficult it's been in some cases to interpret the data. So well done for the analysis and being able to boil it down to some clear statements and recommendations. I think the other thing I'd mention is that this is obviously an evolving area. It's an evolving profile, it's an evolving role. There's very different views out there, which is what we found in the survey. And I would add that we really do value everyone's input, particularly those that have had real experience of undertaking sponsor role, board role, etc., etc. And I'd reiterate what Richard's is saying is that the poll, certainly some of the polls today, do concur with our findings. Not that we're happy about it, but the fact that we've got 64% of the audience today are non-delivery, 36% are senior director, sponsors, head of sponsorship type roles, and that really does reflect in the fact that there seems to be more interest in learning about sponsorship from the non-delivery rather than the senior people, which we need to address. Absolutely right, we do address. So let's address some of your questions. You've had a number of questions come in. Please keep them coming in. It's good. Richard, can I aim the first one at you, please? And
sure.
It was a question aimed around the assessment methodology in a way that people are saying, was there any, self-assessed competencies? Was there any tests to see how honest people were? The benefit scores, in particular, felt a bit optimistic to one particular person. And I know we surveyed different roles, and in some respects there is a bit of a check and balance in the different perceptions of sponsors from directors. But do you have a view on that? I mean, we didn't do a self-assessment. We didn't do a check on it. What's your view on that then?
No, I guess, yeah, so in a way we left it up to the individual clearly to respond, to see how they felt they fit within the categories. But really in the absence, as we said, of that competency framework, there wasn't really anything that we could direct people to see this is what we mean, and these are the levels that we would expect if you were to call yourself an expert, for example. So I think what we tried to do is within the results just look for continuity within each survey result to see did they kind of wildly change their responses across competencies, or was there some consistency, I think, within how they answered the question. What we noticed, I think, was it was harder for people to answer the question in regards to organizational competence. In part, maybe it's a little harder to understand what we were maybe asking, but there was definitely more responses and complete responses, I think, about individual competence, which also suggests to you, I think, that the areas that we identified were appropriate for sponsors. But I think there is room when we do go on and develop the competency framework to review those and maybe add some or focus on other areas.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. Another question here. Isn't the proposal to create the role of delegated sponsors just an acceptance that the role isn't working? And I'll take that because I feel passionate about this one. The answer is yes. or no. The role is certainly not working well. My view is the major reason for it is that people undertaking the sponsor role don't understand what's expected of them, one thing. The boards that they're working for don't know how to make them accountable and don't understand what they're meant to be doing. And invariably, they don't have enough time. You know, the accountability issue, and there's another question being asked about accountability, is really paramount here in the sponsor role. And one of the reasons why organisations have adopted the executive sponsor, delegated sponsor split, they call them different things in different organisations, is to recognise that the accountable executive sponsor is normally a very senior person, normally sitting on the board or close to the board, has real profit and loss accountability in a private sector organisation, and they need help to actually get some of the tasks done. And also, because it's an evolving role, some organisations haven't allowed for it in the past. So I think it's a model that will certainly be used for a while. I can see organisations getting used to it to help with that. Ultimately, whether we'll need the split, it's up. We'll see as time matures. But I think it is something which is needed to try and get the role to work, to try and get the accountability in the right place, but also the tasks and understanding, and someone with time to do those. But I think the accountability is an interesting one, and as Richard has said, using the split of executive and delegated really does help because it shows where the accountability is. I mean, I reviewed a major project in the last few years where I found a load of sponsors who were all external management consultants. You know, they hadn't recognised they were delegated, and there wasn't an executive sponsor in sight. So problem, red flag, as far as I'm concerned. Okay, another one. Go on, Richard.
Oh, sorry, I was just quickly going to say, I think within the organisations that are more mature within sponsorship, I think that distinction is already quite clear. So, and again, the recommendation is potentially is building on, I think, what is working to make sure that that accountability is clear within the roles.
Okay. Questions that you might want to take, Richard. Comments being made, interesting division between this delegated and executive sponsor. Is there any body of research to understand this?
Observation, really. In part, it was identified based on people who are actually practicing within the field, both executive sponsors and delegated sponsors. I mean, from my own experience, that's kind of feels right, I think, in regards to how we interact with our director of sponsorship. Yeah, I think it would be good, I think, to flush out maybe if there's a middle ground between the two, and especially where there's more maturity, I think, within their capital delivery programs, where you're looking at multi-billion-pound investments, you do kind of find yourself with a bit of probably a portfolio sponsor kind of somewhere in the middle. And then are they accountable for that portfolio, but maybe they report to an executive sponsor who kind of sit above them. So actually there's potentially a middle ground there, and there's the delegated team even further under that focus on the day-to-day interactions with the delivery team. So I think there's scope to expand that a bit.
Katherine, could I ask you a question? There's one here that's coming. Was there any differentiation of projects and programs surveyed to see BAU projects and separating these from organisational change initiatives, e.g. new IT implementation, which are different to cultural type change programs?
Okay, I mean, in the survey itself, no. So we didn't ask individuals to differentiate between sort of the initiatives that they were sponsoring. But what we did ask that gave us sort of some background sort of awareness of what it is that people are doing, and the sort of the, I guess, the breadth, the change that organisations are involved in, is we sort of asked some introductory questions around the role of a sponsor and its existence within the organisation, but also whether there's more than one type, as has founded quite a bit of our discussion. And also just reflecting on some of the organisational versus individual competencies. That gave us a sort of an idea as to what sort of kind of change it was that these respondents were dealing with. We do also know who responded, and having an awareness of sort of which organisations are typically known for sort of the scale of the change that they deliver, whether they're predominantly a change delivering organisation or whether project delivery is something that only forms part of what they do. So we have an awareness of that, but actually in terms of differentiating it in the survey, no, we didn't, and possibly something to think about moving forwards.
Okay, thanks, Katherine. Richard, this area of core competency, I think we were all surprised about the low rating of developing vision, which has been reflected by the audience of today. We were surprised by that because we think it's pretty important. But what about business case development? Question here, does business case development training include the identification of benefits? Is there a gap around the selection of strategic objectives and picking the right things to do in the first place?
So I guess identifying the benefits would form the backbone really of the business case, but it depends, I guess, on how you're structuring the business case, because potentially there's a gap in terms of how you're identifying them, but then how you're measuring them to make sure that there's a case for investment. So really there is distinctions, I think, between the competence of identifying those benefits, which mean you would want to make sure that they're kind of the SMART, so measurable and specific, but then also linked to the business strategy. So that's kind of one aspect, but then also building your business case on the back of those benefits. You'll have different methods with those. And again, some may be more measurable than others, and some processes you may be finding are very structured within your organization about how you do that and what is valued over others. And then of course there's the other side of the benefits, which is actually realizing them, but also I think holding those really forefront in your mind when you're holding the delivery teams to account, when you're assessing change, when you're assessing value. Not sure if that really answered the question, but clearly there are distinctions, I think, between the competencies that should be explored further.
Yeah, I think the other thing is that, and this is where we go straight to the top of the shop, so to speak, is that picking the right projects in the first place, having the business case for projects or programs is one thing. Picking the right projects to focus on within your overall portfolio is absolutely a role and responsibility for what I would call the portfolio sponsor, which is the board in most cases. So, getting the right projects picked and making sure you've got proper alignment to strategic objectives. The board cannot sidestep that responsibility, and I see some boards that do. That's also essential as well. Question, Richard, I think it's probably one for you. Do you consider change manager and project sponsor the same?
I don't know, I guess the answer is really it depends. Depends on the job description, and it depends, I think, on what the responsibility or I guess even accountability they're provided for or they're given. If it's about day-to-day implementation of the change, potentially not. But if it's more about kind of tracking, I guess, that change, kind of linking it to strategic objectives and making sure that not just that it's implemented, but the benefits of that are realized, then yes. So I guess it depends.
There is an expectation. So this is something, again, I think for Richards. There's an expectation with most organisations for a project manager to have a recognised qualification, but not so much for the project sponsor. Do you see this changing in the near future?
In a way, I hope so, because that would then mean that there's a qualification that sponsors can actually work towards. And I think that would be really positive, in part because then it would help understand how you can develop within your career as a sponsor. But then also, I think how employers can recognize the individuals that have attained that level of competence, especially within an organization that has quite a variety of programs at different risk exposure levels. You can really kind of start to cater your career to make sure that you're developing within certain areas by taking on more responsibility.
I think the other bit is, of course, that's exactly the area we're going to be concentrating in the fourth webinar of the series, which a date's still to be set for the autumn, but hopefully in September, where we're actually going to look at the whole sponsorship, accreditation, training, qualification, etc. Because I think it is a growing issue amongst a number of organisations. Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to stop the questions and answers now. What we will do, we've captured all the questions that have been answered, and we will endeavour to answer them either through some of our ongoing blogs or in future sessions. So a number of these we're going to pass on to the future sessions. So let's look forward to seeing more of those questions, and we'll try and endeavour to answer most of them during the series. Okay, I'll hand over to you, Richard, just to sum up.
Thank you, Martin. So again, just the webinar series, they were all linked within the registration details, so do click through. We are really keen to get your views and make sure that we're moving forward with kind of the views of the profession and really to be able to support the need. I think just on further resources that are available, we just wanted to make quick reference to the other publications that the governance SIG has worked on, in particular sponsoring change. That really does provide a bit of a backbone for the role. But then other publications in regards to directing change and governance of co-owned project really does link into these type of questions. Finally, we do have quite a few blogs and webinars already on the APM website. With the presentation, these will be linked through, so do please check those out and provide comments. We're really keen to hear from you. So thanks again for joining us.
Thanks everyone, and thanks to my colleagues.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Richard.